philosophy, as in so many other respects, it's now the United States rather than Britain that is the chief centre of activity in the English-speaking world. But there's been American philosophy of international importance for 100 years now. In fact, Bertrand Russell, in his autobiography, describes the Harvard School of Philosophy as having been the best in the world during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. American philosophy of that period is represented above all by three figures who have since attained classic status: C.S. Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. They are sometimes given a group label, the American pragmatists, but in fact they're more different from each other than that might suggest. C.S. Peirce was born in 1839, the son of a professor of mathematics at Harvard. He was trained from the beginning as a mathematician and scientist, and his paid jobs were as astronomer and physicist. Philosophy was something he did in his spare time, until at the age of 48 he retired to devote himself to it entirely. But this, I'm afraid, led to his being sunk in poverty and debt by the time he died in 1914 at the age of 74. He never wrote a book, and a great deal of his work came out only posthumously, when his collected papers were published in 8 volumes. A near contemporary of Peirce was William James, born in 1842 and also educated at Harvard, from which he graduated in medicine. James became a Harvard lecturer in anatomy and physiology, then after that professor of philosophy, and then after that professor of psychology. Among his best-known books are The Principles of Psychology, published in 1890, The Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902, and Pragmatism, published in 1907. He died in 1910. Unlike Peirce, he received international recognition during his lifetime. In this context, it's interesting to mention that the novelist Henry James was one of his brothers, and Henry, for part, if not most of his life, felt himself under the shadow of world-famous elder brother William. The third and most recent of our three classical American philosophers was John Dewey, who was born in 1859 and lived until 1952. He spent the whole of his career as a university teacher, first at the University of Michigan, then in Chicago, and finally at Columbia, New York. Few philosophers of any place or time have had such widespread influence on practical and public affairs. His philosophy of education alone can be said to have had worldwide impact, and he was influential in other fields as well. It's difficult to pick a few books from so copious an output, but perhaps I might mention Democracy and Education, published in 1916, Human Nature and Conduct, published in 1922, Experience and Nature, published in 1925, and The Quest for Certainty, published in 1929. To discuss the work of Dewey, James and Peirce, I've invited Sidney Morgenbesser, Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University in New York. Now let's start right at the beginning of the story. The first of these people in time was Peirce, and it was him who introduced the term pragmatism as a philosophical term. And he introduced it first of all as a maxim for meaning, didn't he? Can you explain exactly what that meant?
Well, it was a maxim for clarification of certain kinds of terms, which are called intellectual terms.
Yes.
It was not necessarily a theory of meaning for all terms or how to analyze all terms. That he also dealt with in a later book, but in this essay, it was primarily a theory of how one analyzes specific terms, or specific ideas, or if you wish, sentences in which these terms are embedded. He was motivated to try to tell someone how he can be clear of his ideas, sort of an approach to give rules for clarification, so that if an agent acts, he at least knows the beliefs clearly upon which he acts. That's the motivation in the background.
Now, what was the pragmatic criterion of meaning? What was that?
Well, I can give it by illustration. You consider the practical effects of the concept, as it were. But let me sort of begin with an example and then see whether we can build up from examples.
Right.
Let's say if I asked you what you meant when you said something, sugar is soluble in water, I presume you would mean that if I or anyone put the sugar in water, it dissolved. Here, to get clearly in mind what you mean, you would specify, if you wish, some conditional as to what would happen, or what kind of consequences would happen, or what actions or habits the particular entity has that you could activate, as it were, by your action.
It relates the meaning of the concept to an actual or possible action, or event, or occurrence.
The meaning would be specified in this conditional.
Right.
So that Now, if you take a particular sentence in the indicative, like this particular hammer is hard, or whatever we will attribute the predicate hard, here's in the indicative, and the Peircean view is, well, you should be able to translate the indicative into these kinds of conditionals. If it were not possible for you, you really wouldn't have a clear concept of mind. Well, it's just hard, hard, hard. And you would then suggest, or he would suggest, to try to clarify the specific kinds of things that if the particular entity was acted upon, some particular observable consequence would happen in terms of scratching or what would...
So to bring it down to ordinary speech, what Peirce is saying is that for certain kinds of concept to be meaningful, then their application in reality must make an observable difference to something. If they don't make an observable difference to anything, then they don't have real content.
Yes, but these are conditionals. They would be.
That's right.
Now,
yes.
This would be is not necessarily a statement that it has carried out.
No. It's about meaning. It's not about occurrence. If I placed it in water, it would
This
dissolve.
is only for the clarification of certain terms.
Right. I want to push the discussion a little further along because although Peirce made this a very substantial contribution to theory of meaning, he wasn't concerned with theory of meaning in a sort of scholastic way, was he? He wasn't concerned with it in isolation. For him, it was all part of a much more general concern with science. I emphasized in my introduction to this discussion how Peirce the man was all his life a working scientist. That's what he was, and he was a logician, and he was concerned to clarify concepts, clarify statements, clarify beliefs as part of a much wider scientific enterprise whose aim was to understand the world and to acquire new knowledge, wasn't it?
Yes.
Can you put it in that context for us?
Well, first I'll amplify some of the remarks about the meaning that you suggested. He said he learned these habits in the laboratory. That's how a scientist gets clear about his terms. And
yes.
In the 20th century, some people thought that one clarifies terms in that way, which is called operational definitions. You know when to apply. If certain things are done by you, then these and these would be the observational consequences. But that's the background, and we now go to the other topic you've introduced, the notion of inquiry.
Right.
And I think we could begin first with Peirce.
And by inquiry, of course, you simply mean finding out about the world, both in common sense terms and more organizedly in scientific terms.
Right.
Yes.
And sort of testing the hypothesis in a suitable way, collecting the hypothesis in a suitable way, having certain rules to tell you when the hypothesis or the inference is a well-formed inference, that when the conclusion follows...
It's the whole nuts and bolts substructure of science that we're talking about.
But now I think one could begin first with sort of a theorist of ordinary beliefs, or the ordinary believer, and taking the notion of belief now for granted, Peirce frequently gives the following picture. I say picture because this isn't quite a full presentation, and suggests this picture to a lot of people, that normally we can sort of go along and rely on our beliefs, and then when we run into a problematic situation, one has to have a strategy for how to revise one's beliefs. And there he begins with possible strategies that one could follow. The method of tenacity, you pick some beliefs and just stick to it. The method of authority, you go to an authority, tell you what to believe. And he gives some reasons why one shouldn't rely on those methods. They're self-defeating. But now the better method is to engage in inquiry and to try to find out by inquiry which particular kind of belief, which is under test, is better than its competitors by actual testing in accord with certain principles. And now, when he does this particular view, he presents another theory, this of how one justifies the beliefs. Thus far, we've talked about the motivation. We engage in inquiry in order to fix our beliefs, and we have to come to a rational decision that we have a right to accept this belief rather than as competitor.
In order to act on it and base further work on it,
well, to have some particular rules in the background to form well-formulated beliefs about the nature of the world, and then given utilities you act. He's not telling you what you should act for. That's part of the ethics and the aesthetics. But now, if by hypothesis one goes a little further, the following picture, once again, is frequently presented as being relevant to Peirce. While we test some beliefs, we're holding some beliefs constant. And then while we're holding some belief constant in one context, we can subject them to check in another context, and the sort of the rationality behind it is this sort of self-correcting process. And we don't have to begin with premises which are certain and indubitable upon which we sort of build our knowledge.
Like mathematics, in fact, you can always start an argument by assuming something, and then the conclusions follow by valid argument from the assumptions.
We're talking about sort of inductive reasoning or empirical justification.
Yes.
Now, the point behind all of this is not to say that, I mean, part of the point is not merely to say this is the way one should view knowledge if one wants knowledge for a basis for action. Other philosophers might agree, but they would want more for knowledge. Knowledge would have to be a stronger view than that. And to counter that strong view, he sometimes talks that we can't get certainty, and the Cartesian arguments for getting certainty don't actually support the conclusion that some philosophers thought it does. So it was a picture of how knowledge and justification could go on. It was a claim that other pictures not merely are not needed, but they can't be, for a variety of reasons, maintained, and therefore it turned out that very people identify Peirce with some theory of fallibilism. Everything is revisable, there's nothing fixed, etc.
Now this introduction of the term fallibilism is very important. And indeed, Peirce was a pioneer of the whole idea, and it was a revolutionary idea in its day. Until and including, I think, virtually the whole of the 19th century, Western man regarded science as a secure and copper-bottomed and safe and sure and unchanging body of knowledge. The scientific knowledge was certain knowledge, and it was, for that reason, incorrigible, unchanging. Peirce introduced, and was one of the very first people, if not the first person, to introduce the notion that this is not so, that all science is corrigible, all science is fallible, that we use scientific theories for as long as they work, but we must be prepared to replace them if we come up against difficulties with them. Now that's an orthodoxy in the 20th century. All scientists take that view in our time, but they certainly didn't in Peirce's.
Currently, lots of people take this view of fallibilism sort of as an aim of science, that science shouldn't aim as a complete theory, that one should never say, I've got it now, I've just got it, that science, by definition, is open to perpetual revolution. Now, that is a thesis which sometimes is associated with fallibilism, which I'm not sure quite what to say about, but it's a different...
Well, let's not go into that now.
But when it comes to science, one gets a different picture from Peirce. The picture is a scientist entering into a community. He's part of a community of investigators. Truth, if you wish, is a sort of a property of the community in a sense which I'll try to specify. The actual scientist is not there as an individual. He's sort of understood primarily as a member of the group, and then we can talk about inquiry in general. And there,
as a group activity and as an institutionalized
right, you enter
activity.
into an institution which is rational and reasonable,
yes.
And then one engages in inquiry. And Peirce has lots of things to say about the stages of inquiry. As for example, the inductive phase, when hypotheses are put up to test, and the reasons for accepting them as testable. Deductive phase, when the consequences are noted, and the inductive phase, when the actual results are assessed. And he has a great deal to say about all of these things, for which he may be credited as a forerunner of diverse kinds of people like Hegel or Popper, who have differences among them, but would all claim that this is along the lines that he has suggested. So we have this picture of science, and part of Peirce's later motivation is to try to see what justification he can give for someone entering into this kind of a community. But now, given this view of science, and also the view that if one wants to say that science captures the real, or what's out there, one has to sort of take it this way, because whatever the real is, whatever we think is out there independently of us, one can't actually think that it's only accessible to an individual person. The real should be accessible to the community. It's independent of any particular agent. And now the agent and the inquiry, well, what's its goal? And here one has two aspects of Peirce. One aspect is, well, what sense could we give for truth in this particular context? After all, we very frequently think of each individual belief may be wrong, even though I think it's true, it may be wrong, and this way, what sort of guarantee, if you like the word, of truth is there? What concept can we give to truth? And he tries to develop the notion that when we say a given belief is true, what we have in mind is that this opinion actually will survive and be embedded into the final body of science, if that is a correct way of talking.
Now, up to this point, we've been talking almost entirely about Peirce, and I want to bring James more centrally into the picture now. It was William James, although it was Peirce who coined the philosophical term pragmatism, it was actually James who made the term generally known among educated people at large. And this was done primarily by his book, indeed the title of his book, Pragmatism, which was published in 1907, wasn't it? Now, what were some of the main themes of this book?
Well, the book is a very rich book, and it contains a number of diverse and interconnected theses. First, it's a critique of certain kinds of philosophical positions on the ground that they were not really relevant to the problems of their generation, of his generation, primarily the conflict between science and religion, which was one of the things he and his contemporaries wrestled with for a long time. Secondly, he criticizes some, but not all, of the philosophical theses, are not being sort of pragmatically different. I don't think he ever proves the case, but he sort of tries to...
When you say pragmatically different, what you mean is that there were a number of apparently alternative philosophies which were only apparently alternative, because when you actually examined them, you found that there was no specific evidence or even possible experience which could differentiate between them. And therefore, cognitively, they were equivalent.
One of the things, yes, as he said that way. And secondly, he frequently also thought that they were not really different as far as basing a particular kind of decision as to how to live. They
made no difference for purposes of action.
In that particular sense. Now, this, whether or not he proves this is an interesting thing, but I'm not sure he does, but this is the kind of theme that he tries to introduce. The second kind of theme that he tries to introduce is that one looks at a lot of these traditional metaphysical pictures, one should sort of look at them as pictures, and that his own view is of a lot of the metaphysics, even his own, is sort of one which is based not merely on the evidence, but in terms of sort of bias for looking for certain kinds of things, certain personal preferences, and he gives his own, and he asks his other colleagues to do so as well. Well, the whole notion of a picture and how one justifies or looks a philosophical thing, once again, just some. The reason I'm hesitating is because the book is dedicated to John Stuart Mill, and he's not sort of saying pragmatism comes in and it's completely novel. As a matter of fact,
and all other philosophy goes out of the window. He's not saying that. He's saying it's a continuation of some already familiar modes of thinking.
Now, the other theme that he introduces, for which he's been actually both criticized and lauded, is his approach to knowledge, conceptual schemes, and truth, and that he also deals with them in other books, but this is central things in this particular book.
Now, I'd like us to take up the last of those, because only a moment ago you were giving us quite a long but very interesting exposition of Peirce's theories of meaning and of truth. How did James's conception of meaning and of truth differ from Peirce's?
Well, he starts with how our knowledge evolves and how conceptual schemes evolve, and emphasizes that very often we have evolving conceptual schemes, and one really can't ask whether this conceptual scheme or that conceptual scheme is actually better or worse. One has to judge between conceptual schemes in terms of the particular use to which they're put. Now, that's one particular thing, the sort of pragmatic justification, not of the notion of truth, but the notion of conceptual scheme. There's also a deeper thing as to whether or not he actually wants to say, and he does want to say, that we can't give an account of our conceptual schemes as sort of merely statements about how the world is independent of us. The way we classify the world is actually constitutive of what we think the world is. We're sort of always thinking from within with our conceptual scheme. But now let's assume we have a conceptual scheme, and all these problems about...
We've got a view of the world.
Well,
I
say, I'm not sure one has to do it in terms of a total conceptual scheme, but particular things. There is a lot of work going on by people influenced by James on this as to whether one looks at one description as incompatible with another, and one looks at sort of descriptions, and that descriptions, whether or not they're contraries. All of these things are being worked on. But now let's assume that we have some notion of a local conceptual scheme rather than a whole total scheme, because it may be pointless.
You don't necessarily have to be talking about a view of the world in general, but of some particular area of inquiry.
Yeah, it's very difficult to know whether a clear notion can be given to a total...
Yes.
All right, now, then let's say we fix our language, and then the question of truth can arise. Then partly he seems to be asking himself the following question: what actually is the difference between saying that a particular sentence like this table is brown and adding this table is brown is true? And often maybe he can be interpreted as saying, well, prima facie it's puzzling, nothing seems to be added. And
to say that a sentence is true is to do no more than a certain sentence.
Yeah, well, in a way, I mean, this may be a misleading way of putting it, but it's sort of like you can take a theory that way and then ask, well, what is added? And James seems to be suggesting that what is added is some sort of commendatory use or evaluative use, that to talk about its truth is to sort of say about the sentence that actually it's worthy of belief, or it's good to believe, and these kind of evaluative predicates. And then he tries to work it out, and he tries to work it out either in terms of verification or in terms of satisfaction. So sometimes he gives some view that the truth can be identified with the verifiable, or the exhaustively verified, and verified by an action. One has a belief, one acts on it, and then it leads to satisfactory results. So this actual criticism of James on this point is his use of satisfaction is misleading. It has really nothing to do with truth. It may have something to do with the rationality of action. A person may be rational in believing something, even if it isn't true, but that's a different, maybe agreed to talk about the rationality of action, and for that one doesn't need certainty. But the particular issue under consideration, whether this is an illuminating notion of truth, and to many people, James is misleading how he works it out, but this general approach could be, at least in part, suggested for truth. The picture very often James once again gives is that should give, is that in certain contexts, on certain kind of canonical conditions, if a sentence is verified, then the question of truth may actually disappear. The gap between truth and verification might disappear or be identified. Now,
I wanted to interrupt you there because I want to move our discussion on to Dewey. We spent a period on Peirce, a period on James, and we must leave some time for Dewey. Before we leave James, what I wanted to do was to put in a word of commendation for his writing, his prose style. I think that James is, and it needs to be said in this program about him and others, that he is one of the great writers of philosophy in the history of philosophy. Some wag once said that when you read William James's books and you read Henry James's books, you realize that Brother William was the natural novelist and Brother Henry was the natural philosopher. And the point of that joke is that William James's writing actually contains all the qualities of great creative writing. It's imaginative, it's full of surprise, it's ingenious, it's full of striking metaphor, simile, imagery, and so on. And I do want to say before we leave him that anyone who is stimulated by our discussion to go away and read James is in for a serious pleasure.
Well, may I add to your remarks?
Yes, do.
I mean, all these three men seem to me, but in some sense remarkable, in some sense worthy of respect. But I'd like to fill out some of the things about Peirce. He's sort of an awesome figure. The tremendous issues and the variety of issues that he dealt with, logic, inquiry, a certain kind of metaphysics, He's been called by some people the Leibniz of America.
Well, when I looked him up in the current issue of the Encyclopedia Britannica for this program to check a date, I saw that it says about him that he's the greatest intellect yet produced by the Americas. Now that's an astounding claim to make for an individual.
Well, I'm merely also...
I'm not asking you to underwrite it, but it is an extraordinary claim.
He seems to me an awesome figure.
Yes.
James is one of the great, lovely, admirable figures in the history of philosophy. He's a person, he's warm, outgoing. His writings range over so many topics. The Principles of Psychology itself is a classic. It's still being read and reread by a great number of people, even when they disagree with James on his specific views about psychological matters. They find him very interesting and very insightful. The other thing is also his approach to mind. He started sort of giving sort of a biological particular approach to the life of the mind as to how one understands mental action. And Dewey, of course, was a man who was a man true to his word. He didn't merely preach that philosophers should be engaged in public life. He did, and also he didn't merely say they should be naturalists. He tried to work out the details. And his attack on all sorts of dualisms, which presumably I suppose is partly to be understood in terms of his Hegelian background, he also applied this to a variety of issues, the analysis of social issues and political issues. He has this great range. He was a liberal and a kind man. It's interesting, when Russell wrote The History of Philosophy, he sort of said he has so much admiration for Dewey, he's just sorry he has to disagree with him.
Another point worth making about Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy is that the only philosopher living at the time when that book was written and published who had a chapter devoted to him in it was John Dewey. Well, let's now move to Dewey. We've talked about Peirce and James and their attempts to improve the methods by which human beings can acquire new knowledge and increase their understanding of their environment, both in an ordinary life context and in an organized way through science. And we've talked about how this involved them in, among many other things, clarifying exactly what it is we mean by the concept of meaning, clarifying exactly what we mean by the concept of truth, and finding what the proper functioning of these concepts is within an overall conception of inquiry, whether in ordinary life or scientific inquiry. Now, that's the position up to which we've taken the discussion now. Now, Dewey, the real starting point for Dewey was enormous impressedness with the success of science. He saw that this science that we've been talking about over the last 300 or 400 years has supplied mankind with far and away its most reliable knowledge, far and away its quantitatively biggest amount of reliable knowledge. It's a huge success story, almost unprecedented in the cognitive history of mankind. Well, in fact, unprecedented. Now, thought Dewey, what is it about science that gives it this fantastic success? And is it something that we can apply to other areas of life, notably the social sciences, political life, social problems, and so on, with the same rich success? That was really his starting point, wasn't it? Can you take it up?
He gave some reasons, if you wish, for the success of science, at least in the sense that science couldn't have been successful unless there was some possibility of continuation, and there's certain science being institutionalized, its habits being institutionalized, and men and women engaged in cooperative research. So,
yes, but what really struck Dewey about the successfulness of science wasn't due to its institutionalization, was it? It was due to its method.
Yeah, but the method is institutionalized.
You think the institutionalization is
well,
part of
in a way,
method?
okay.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
no, part of the notion, no. I should be clear. Part of the method is the method of drawing inference, but also the method of cooperative research and how one engages in kinds of decisions about cooperative research. So he gave some particular explanation of the social support and some particular explanation in terms of this method. Scientists could engage in cooperative research were it not this agreement on how one can adjudicate conflicting alternatives. The scientific community would not remain stable. Now, obviously, the Dewey picture or some picture like that is at best the first approximation, and one has to work out all sorts of arguments as to whether or not this always can hold, or whether it holds only in certain cases, and there's discussion about that. But now one can push, okay, granted, but how do we know it will continue in the future? Maybe tomorrow, suddenly, all the attempts to accept a theory on the basis of evidence, etc., will lead to failure. How do we know the world isn't chaotic and ultimately, or it won't change? And now, it's these kinds of questions that get puzzling, and possibly one might think of this as deeply enough as sort of a request, if one wants to talk this way, as a sort of justification of induction, relying on certain kinds of observable outcomes to project. And for this, Dewey doesn't really want to engage in this kind of a question. He avoids that kind of a question. But granted that in some sense we accept induction, in some sense of induction, because as you know how difficult it is to formulate that phrase without begging lots of issues about science. If we do, then we can rely on the past history of science to indicate we're rationally entitled to rely on its method. It has over time proven better than its competitors, as you've pointed out, but that's internal justification. Now, whether or not this actually is the truth, once again, as some people think that this is sort of rigged. They've been better than competitors because the competitors haven't given a fair chance of competing. But anyway, this is sort of talking about the justification of our acceptance of science, the pragmatic justification on continuation of reliance in science. But now, as you point out, this is one question about the justification of science. The other issue is justification from within. What kind of procedures one could use to come to some particular desirable or reasonable, or what he would say warranted outcome of inquiry. This interconnection with formal rules, contextual factors.
In his formulation of a view of scientific method, he rejected what he saw as being the most common of all the predecessor theories, and on at least one occasion he designated that as the spectator view of knowledge. He said that Western man had made one fundamental error for hundreds of years in his philosophy by thinking of man as a spectator on the world. The world is something that we look at, that we observe, and through our observations we acquire knowledge of it. That whole model, said Dewey, is entirely misleading because we are not spectators, we're agents. We are biological organisms living in an environment in which we've got to survive. Knowledge is just about the most important and useful single tool for survival that we have in this situation, because it confers understanding of our environment, and that confers a certain degree of mastery of the environment. So we're not spectators at all. We're in amongst it, having to act all the time on the basis of beliefs right or wrong, or imperfect or inadequate as they may be. And it's in that situation that we're trying to acquire understanding and knowledge, and proceeding with our inquiries. So his whole view of scientific method and of the acquisition of knowledge and the growth of knowledge was seen from the standpoint not of a spectator, an observing subject, as previous philosophers had so frequently said, but from the standpoint of an agent, wasn't it?
Well, a great number of themes in Dewey are captured by your analysis, but a lot of these themes are not merely theses about knowledge. It's also theses of how one understands a particular, as I say, a human being naturalistically. It's to avoid certain kind of dualisms, that one could sort of think there's a mind and a body, and one looks for their interconnections. And he turns out actually to be very, very naturalistic. Humans are organisms. One learns about human organisms in terms of how they act and interact with the world. And he's always given this action and transaction. That's part of Dewey's general philosophical anthropology, if one wants to look in terms of part of his quasi-behavioral analysis of mental concepts, and also part of the notion is one has to look for institutional factors, or the culture in which one lives, to explain certain kinds of judgments and to explain why certain kinds of perceptual judgments are made. Also, in relationship to the theory of knowledge, he wants to get away from another kind of picture that's frequently been associated with the pragmatist, namely that men are primarily acting and reacting on the world and trying to improve it. And he wants to say no, and he gives lots of theories, lots of theses, to show how knowledge is sort of comes under special circumstances, where the demand of inquiry comes about. It's not that we're always inquiring. To use a loose phrase, we're in the world in all sorts of ways, and Dewey tries to specify it. When it comes to actual knowledge, Dewey isn't interested in a general analysis of knowledge. He says the word knowledge is used in all sorts of ways, but what he's interested in is the specific sense of knowledge, what he thinks is the reasonable one, namely how one acquires warranted beliefs as a result of inquiry. And he thought that's the aim of knowledge, to get warranted beliefs and to get warranted beliefs as a result of inquiry, especially when there's a need for revision of beliefs. Now, secondly, he wants to get away from this view which you call the spectator theory of knowledge, in another sense of the spectator theory of knowledge, namely that belief has certain kinds of objects, knowledge has other kinds of objects, and that if we can get certainty, we can't sort of have certainty about these specific objects which are sort of transitory, and if we're going to get knowledge which is certain, we have to get it knowledge by being sort of suitably cognitively related to a certain kind of entity. So this is, he thinks this is sort of an approach that lots of people had, which he's debating against. He's also debating against the view that somehow one can jump out of our particular conceptual scheme, and to judge our conceptual scheme is to see whether it sort of matches an independent reality.
A moment ago, or when you were talking about Deweyan science, you had something to say about his view of the importance of the institutionalization of science and the institutionalization of inquiry. And in fact, Dewey, one striking characteristic of Dewey as a philosopher was that he attached very special importance to institutions generally, because he regarded all pursuit of knowledge as really essentially a species activity, an almost biologically based species activity. And he also thought, in the special case of science, that one reason for the great success of science was its institutionalization of criticism. So he had a lot to say about institutions in general and their role in society. Now, his philosophy had a great impact on institutions, didn't it? And in particular, I mentioned right at the beginning of this program, he had a special impact on educational institutions throughout the world, not only in the United States. Can you draw our discussion to a close by just telling us something of what Dewey's impact was on education in his own time and subsequently?
Well, he approached his approach to institutions, as you pointed out, was sort of multi-layered, and he frequently thought that given institutions are frequently justified by certain kinds of, let's say, ideologies, and they're frequently justified by certain assumptions about what humans are, and he thought that a lot of the actual justifications could not actually be warranted. The pictures they give of man are actually pictures of man as they are under those current situations, and not as a picture of what man could be. Secondly, they're frequently in the justification.
You mean the picture of man that certain institutions provide are in a sense circular because they are pictures of man as he is living within those institutions?
Right.
Yes.
Secondly, that a lot of people believe that you can only justify claims for institutional arrangements by actually seeing whether or not these things ultimately rest on sort of value questions, and one has to prove that these particular value judgments are ultimate, and etc. He tries to, well, this is part of his general theory of ethics, in which he wants to show the continuity between justification and ethics and justification and morals. He was always against the view that there was a dualism between fact and value. And then the role of the philosopher is to criticize some of these particular kinds of doctrines, and secondly, try to have something to say about the concrete institutional arrangements that were made at that time. And so what he does in this book, a number of his books, is take for granted...
Which book? You haven't named
Democracy
the book.
and Education.
Yep.
And previous writings, that's the classic.
Yes.
Is to take for granted that a theory of education should be contextually relevant, that though there are invariant features of human life, there's no unique best way of organizing them. And the problem is to rationally discuss what institutional requirements are necessary under these specific conditions. Now, so part of the criticism of traditional philosophies of education was that they frequently justified on dubious psychological assumptions. They're frequently justified on dubious meta-ethical things of how things could be justified. And he then shows, at least to his particular kind of satisfaction, that those are previously used to justify certain claims about education. Also, they're based on dubious psychological theories about effort, about emotion, about discipline, and doing those, he introduces his own positive theories as to how discipline comes from being involved in the activity rather than necessarily the reverse.
He was a pioneer opponent, wasn't he, of the old-fashioned idea of education that saw it as something imposed on the child by discipline, by almost force majeure from without, and saw the essence of education as being something that had to go along with the growth and development of the child, had to be from within, had to have the child's interests and energies, so to speak, flowing with it and working for it. Thank you very much, Professor Morgenbesser.
Thank you.